She pounded desperately on the door, but no one answered. Helpless and trembling, she slowly turned around. A soldier, his dark desire long suppressed, was slowly approaching her like a predator closing in on its prey. As the distance between them shortened, the sinister expression on the soldier's face became clearer. His eyes scanned her up and down, studying the young and beautiful woman before him. At that moment, Anonyma was like a bird trapped in a cage, with nowhere to run, forced to face whatever came next. Outside the door sat a group of her fellow Germans, yet none of them stood up to open the door or save her, because at that time, the streets and alleys of Berlin were filled with Soviet soldiers carrying loaded guns. Trapped and powerless, the people could only sit in silence, forced to witness Anonyma's suffering and humiliation. Realizing she couldn't escape her fate, Anonyma smiled faintly and told the soldier not to stay here, then led him deeper into the room. But to her surprise, the room wasn't just a closed space, it was actually connected to a passage leading outside. Seeing a glimmer of hope, Anonyma seized the moment, slammed the iron door shut, and ran for her life. She sprinted all the way out into the open street, but there were even more Soviet soldiers standing everywhere. Many of them began to whistle at her. Panicked, she rushed toward a Soviet officer, believing that he would protect her and bring justice, but the officer simply said, "My soldiers are all healthy and clean." His cold words shattered Anonyma's heart completely. She stared at the officer's back in silent horror as he walked away. Only a Soviet female medic glanced at her with sympathy, but in the end, she too turned and left. The officer's words had silently allowed the soldier's cruelty to continue. In that instant, more and more soldiers began committing acts of violence against the women of Berlin without restraint. The streets and alleys became a nightmare for the city's women. On her way home, Anonyma was dragged into an alley by another soldier. Though she struggled and cried out in despair, she was no match for the man's strength. Afterward, the soldier left, and Anonyma sat in silence for a long time, hollow and numb. Eventually, for the sake of seeing her beloved husband again, the man she still didn't know whether was alive or dead, Anonyma forced herself to stand up once more. Her own home had already been destroyed in the fighting, reduced to ruins, so she took shelter in the home of a kind widow. Inside the widow's house were many others like Anonyma, people who had lost everything and had nowhere else to go. They huddled together in whispers, discussing the future of Germany and what their lives would be like from now on, because just moments ago, the news had spread their Führer, Adolf Hitler, had taken his own life. Downstairs, the Soviet troops were already celebrating their great victory with loud cheers and gunfire. Before long, the drunken soldiers once again began to storm through Berlin, bringing terror to the women of the city. Loud knocks echoed through the widow's house where Anonyma was hiding. Panic spread among the people, and everyone scattered to hide. Only Anonyma remained seated, motionless, because she knew there was nowhere to run. Soon, a Soviet officer appeared in front of her. Seeing the young and beautiful woman, his gaze grew unsettling. What followed left Anonyma numb and broken. When he left, the officer even lingered around her, smiling, and told her he would return. Anonyma could only sit there in silence, her eyes empty. After he was gone, she broke down completely, screaming, throwing things, but nothing could change what had already happened. When she stepped out of the room, another soldier was waiting in the hall, watching her closely. He tried to talk to her, as if what had just happened meant nothing. Anonyma fought to control her anger. She didn't want to provoke anyone. All she could think about was surviving. She needed to stay alive, to wait for her husband, whose fate was still unknown. But the nightmare did not end. In the days that followed, Anonyma and countless other women across Berlin suffered the same horror again and again. The entire city had become a living nightmare for its women. Desperate and with nowhere left to turn, Anonyma finally went to see a Soviet major, begging him to help.
Gestern wurde unser Haus besetzt und viele Frauen vergewaltigt.
But the officer coldly replied that he knew nothing. When she pleaded again, the major said, "Tell me, on one side are my soldiers who fought and bled for victory, and on the other are the women of Berlin who once supported the Nazi army. Who should I help?" His words shattered her last bit of hope. Realizing that no one would protect her, Anonyma decided to take control of her own fate. If she couldn't escape this cruel reality, she would at least try to find one man powerful enough to shield her from the others. She began to approach a Soviet officer, trying to survive through his protection. The officer accepted her closeness and visited her that very night, bringing food and wine. For the sake of safety, Anonyma forced herself to smile and be polite, though her heart was filled with pain. But in the end, even that fragile protection turned out to be an illusion. Just when Anonyma had completely lost hope, The Soviet major, the one who always seemed cold and unfeeling, suddenly appeared at her door. She thought his intentions were the same as those of the other soldiers, so she quietly stepped into the room and began to undress. But to her surprise, the major stood at the doorway for a moment, looked at her, then turned around and walked away. He was a Soviet officer, a man who had led his troops into Berlin only a few days earlier. Many soldiers who entered the fallen city, after years of brutal war, began to take their pain and anger out on the women of Berlin, and many of the higher-ranking officers chose to look the other way. In those days, Berlin had truly become a living nightmare for its women, but as the chaos grew worse, the fair-minded major began to feel a deep unease in his heart. One day, when he saw two soldiers tormenting a German woman, he suddenly remembered the woman who had twice come to him begging for help, Anonyma. Without fully understanding why, he found himself standing outside her home. Seeing the major appear again, the weary and frightened Anonyma thought she knew what was coming and began to take off her clothes. But once more, the major only stood there for a few seconds and then turned and left in silence. That same night, a drunken soldier bragged loudly about what he had done in the city and flaunted the jewelry he had stolen, shouting for everyone to join him. Hearing those words, the major finally made up his mind. He returned to Anonyma's home, this time bringing several of his men. Along with food and wine, they drank and laughed, retelling their stories from the front lines. Anonyma, who by now felt deep resentment toward the soldiers, forced a faint smile and joined their conversation. Throughout the evening, the major remained quiet, his gaze fixed on Anonyma. He didn't know when it had started, but somewhere along the way, he had fallen in love with this brave and resilient woman from Berlin. Suddenly, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed from outside. The major rushed out with his men and saw a group of soldiers preparing to enter the building and harm the women inside. He immediately shouted them down and ordered them to leave. From that day on, the major began visiting Anonyma often, and because of his presence, no other soldiers dared to enter that building again. While the rest of Berlin was filled with chaos and despair, that single apartment block became a rare place of calm, a fragile haven in the middle of ruin. Anonyma, desperate for protection, gradually accepted the major's presence and relied on his shield of authority to keep her safe. The major even stationed guards outside her door to stop anyone from disturbing her. The officer who had once hurt Anonyma tried again and again to bribe the guards to let him in, but they refused every offer. Frustrated, he could only glance up toward the balcony where Anonyma stood, then walk away in defeat. As time passed, Anonyma learned more about what had happened on the other side of the war, about how the German army had slaughtered and tortured countless Soviet civilians. She also discovered that the major's wife had been killed by the Germans, hanged during the invasion. At that moment, she finally understood why he had refused to help her before and why the soldiers' rage toward German women had burned so deeply. It was a cruel cycle of vengeance, pain repaid with more pain. She walked aimlessly through the shattered streets of Berlin, realizing that the soldiers she once saw as invaders were, in their own way, broken men driven by loss and hate. Meanwhile, the German officers still defending Berlin finally received their last command to surrender. The streets erupted in cheers from the Soviet troops, celebrating their victory. But inside the ruined homes, the German civilians sat in silence, their faces heavy with despair. They had hoped for a miracle counterattack, a final stand, but that hope was now gone forever. As the triumphant Soviet songs echoed through the streets, every German heart burned with silent fury, and just like before, the Soviet major, carrying the joy of victory, came once again to visit Anonyma. Ever since the death of his wife, the major had remained alone until now. He had completely fallen for the German woman before him. With the war nearing its end, he wanted to bring Anonyma back to the Soviet Union with him, but just as he was about to speak his heart, a sudden gunshot rang out from outside. Just moments earlier, a Soviet soldier had accidentally entered Anonyma's storage room only to come face to face with a hidden German soldier. The German fired first, but missed his shot. In the struggle that followed, he was thrown down the stairs and died on impact. When the Soviet soldiers arrived, they found a grenade on the dead soldier's body. Immediately, the entire building was placed under strict investigation, since the soldier had been hiding in Anonyma's home. The major turned nervously to ask her if she knew anything. Anonyma shook her head and said she had no idea, but she was lying. Still, the major chose to believe her and decided to let the matter go. His men, however, disagreed. They insisted that even if she wasn't guilty, the major should cut ties with her, and they demanded she be taken in for questioning, but the major firmly ordered them to drop the issue. News quickly spread through the ranks that the woman protected by the major had once harbored an armed enemy soldier. The major and Anonyma's relationship became the subject of every whispered conversation. Some even quietly called him a traitor, but the Major no longer cared. He only wanted to bring Anonyma back to the Soviet Union, to spend the rest of his life by her side. Hearing his words, Anonyma gave a faint, cold smile, because the truth was, she had only approached the Major in the beginning to protect herself, to shield herself from the terrifying soldiers that roamed the streets. In her heart, the only one she had ever thought about was her husband missing, possibly dead, and she was German. She loved her country. That was why, when war broke out, she had chosen to return to Berlin. Anonyma told the Major firmly, she loved her husband, and she loved Germany. She would never leave with him. Her words shattered the Major. He couldn't believe that the woman he had given everything to still held another man in her heart. The truth was, after spending so much time together, Anonyma had grown to care for the Major, but because of her husband, because of her homeland, and because of everything the war had torn apart, fate would never allow them to be together. Soon, the war came to an end. The Major was ordered to leave Berlin with his unit, and at long last, Anonyma's husband returned from a Soviet POW camp, but he had already heard the rumors. He questioned her again and again. In the end, Anonyma gave him her diary, a journal where she had written down everything she had been through, every humiliation, every hardship she had endured just to survive. But after reading it, her husband didn't offer comfort or understanding. Instead, he exploded, smashing everything in their home in rage. Anonyma stood silently behind the door, watching him lose control, saying nothing. 2 days later, her husband left. He didn't say where he was going, or whether he'd ever return, and Anonyma stayed behind. Starting a life alone, she waited, day after day, for her husband to come back. The war had ended, but the pain it left behind, the scars, the losses would linger much longer. Some wounds never truly heal. I'm a movie enthusiast. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.